Chapter 13 of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anything You Can Do, Chapter 13. He was walking again. He didn't quite remember how he had left the automat, and he really didn't even try to remember. He was trying to remember other things, further back, before he had what? Before the Institute. Before the beginning of the operations. The memories were there, all right. He could sense them, floating in some sort of mental limbo, just beyond the grasp of his conscious mind, like the memories of a dream after one has awakened. Each time he would try to reach into the darkness to grasp one of the pieces, it would shatter into smaller bits. The big patterns were too fragile to withstand the direct probing of his conscious mind, and even the resulting fragments did not want to hold still long enough to be analyzed. And while a part of his mind probed frantically after the elusive particles of memory, another part of it watched the process with semi-detached amusement. He had always known there were holes in his memory. Always? Don't kid yourself, pal. But it was disconcerting to find an area that was as full of holes as a used machine gun target. The whole fabric had been punched to bits. No man's memory is completely available at any given time. Whatever the recording process is, however completely every bit of data may be recorded during a lifetime, much of it is unavailable. It may be incompletely cross-indexed, or in some instances labeled "Do Not Scan." Or, metaphorically, the file drawer may be locked. It may be that, in many cases, if a given bit of data remains unscanned for a long enough period, it fades into illegibility, never reinforced by the scanning process. Sensory data, coming in from the outside world as it does, is probably permanent. But the thought patterns originating within the mind itself, the processes that correlate and cross-index and speculate on and hypothesize about the sensory data, these are much more fragile. A man might glance once through a Latin primer and have each and every page imprinted indelibly on his recording mechanism, and still be unable to make sense out of "nauta incubita cum puella est." Sometimes a man is aware of the holes in his memory. What was the name of that fellow I met at Eddie's party? Can't remember it for the life of me. At other times a memory may lay dormant and completely unremembered, leaving no apparent gap, until a tag of some kind brings it up. That girl with the long hair reminds me of Susie Blugerhugel. My gosh, I haven't thought of her in years. Both factors seemed to be operating in Bart Stanton's mind at this time. Incredibly, he had never, in the past year at least, had occasion to try to remember much about his past life. He had known who he was without thinking about it particularly, and the rest of his knowledge, language, history, social behavior, politics, geography, and so on, had been readily available for the most part. Ask an educated man to give the product of the primes 2, 13, and 41, or ask him to give the date of the Norman Conquest, and he can give you the answers very quickly. He may have to calculate the first, which will make him pause for a second before answering, but the second will come straight out of his memory records. In neither case does he have to think of where he learned the process or fact, or who taught it to him, or when he got the information. But now the picture and the name in the paper had brought forth a reaction in Stanton's mind, and he was trying desperately to bring the information out of oblivion. Did he have a mother? Surely. But could he remember her? Yes, certainly. A pretty, gentle, rather sad woman. He could remember when she died, although he couldn't remember ever having actually attended the funeral. What about his father? Try as he might, he could find no memory whatever of his father, and at first that bothered him. He could remember his mother, could almost see her moving around in the apartment where they had lived, in Denver, sure. and he could remember the big building itself, and the block, and even Mrs. Frobisher, who lived upstairs. And the school, and the play area. A great many memories came crowding back, but there was no trace of his father. And yet— oh, of course! That was it! His father had been killed in an accident when Martin Bart were very young. Martin Bart. The name flitted through his mind like a scrap of paper in a high wind, but mentally he reached out and grasped it. Martin Bart. Martin Bart. Bart. Mart and Bart. The Stanton twins. It was very curious, he thought, that he should have forgotten his brother, and even more curious that the name in the paper had not brought him instantly to mind. Martin, the cripple. Martin, the boy with the poor, weak, radiation-shattered nervous system. The boy who had had to stay in a therapeutic chair all his life because his efferent nerves could not control his body. The boy who couldn't speak, or rather, wouldn't speak, because he was ashamed of the gibberish that resulted. Martin, the non-entity, the nothing, the nobody. The one who watched and listened and thought, but could do nothing. Bart Stanton stopped suddenly and unfolded the newspaper again under the glow of the street lamp. His memory certainly didn't jibe with this. His eyes ran down the column of type. Mr. Martin has, in the years since he has been in the Belt, run up an enviable record, both as an insurance investigator and as a police detective, although his connection with the Planetoid Police is, necessarily, an unofficial one. Probably not since Sherlock Holmes has there been such mutual respect and cooperation between the official police and a private investigator. There was only one explanation, Stanton thought. Martin, too, had been treated by the Institute. His memory was still blurry and incomplete, he knew, but he did suddenly remember that a decision had been made for Martin to take the treatment. He chuckled a little at the irony of it. It looked as though they hadn't been able to make a Superman of Martin, but they had been able to make a normal and extraordinarily capable human being of him, he thought. Now it was Bart who was the freak, the odd one. Turnabout is fair play, he thought, but somehow it didn't seem quite fair. He crumpled the newspaper, dropped it into a nearby waste chute, and walked on through the night toward the Neurophysical Institute. Fourth Interlude. "You understand, Mrs. Stanton," said the psychiatrist, "that a great part of Martin's trouble is mental as well as physical. Because of the nature of his ailment, he has withdrawn, pulled himself away from communication with others. If these symptoms had been brought to my attention earlier, the mental disturbance might have been more easily analyzed and treated." "I suppose so. I'm sorry, Doctor," said Mrs. Stanton. Her manner betrayed weariness and pain. "It was so difficult. Martin could never talk very well, you know, and he just talked less and less as the years went by. It was so slow and so gradual that I never really noticed it." Poor woman, the doctor thought. She's not well herself. She should have married again years ago, rather than force herself to carry the whole burden alone. Her role as a doting mother hasn't helped either of the boys to overcome the handicaps that were already present. "I've honestly tried to do my very best with Martin," Mrs. Stanton went on unhappily. "And so has Bart, I know. When they were younger, Bart used to take him out all the time. They went everywhere together. Of course, I don't expect Bart to do that so much any more. He has his own life to live. He can't take Martin out on dates or things like that. He has interests outside the home now, like other boys his age. That's only normal. But when he's at home, Bart helps me with Martin all the time." "I understand," said the psychiatrist. "This is no time to tell her that Bartholomew's tests indicate that he has subconsciously resented Martin's presence for a long time," he thought. "She has enough to worry about." "I don't understand," said Mrs. Stanton, breaking into sudden tears. "I just don't understand why Martin should behave this way. Why should he just sit there with his eyes closed and ignore everybody? Why should he ignore his mother and his brother? Why?" The doctor comforted her in a warmly professional manner. Then, as her tears subsided, he said, "We don't understand all the factors ourselves, Mrs. Stanton. At first glance, Martin's reactions appear to be those one would expect of schizophrenic withdrawal. But there are certain aspects of the case that make it unusual. His behavior doesn't quite follow the pattern we usually expect from such cases as this. His extreme physical disability has drastically modified the course of his mental development, and at the same time made it difficult for us to make any analysis of his mental state." If only, he added to himself, she had followed the advice of her family physician years ago. If she had only put the boy under the proper care, none of this would have happened. "Is there anything we can do, Doctor?" she asked. "We don't know yet," he said gently. He considered for a moment, then said, "Mrs. Stanton, I'd like for you to leave both of the boys here for a few days, so that we can perform further tests. That will help us a great deal in evaluating the circumstances, and help us get at the root of Martin's trouble." She looked at him with a little surprise. "Why, yes, of course, if you think it's necessary. But why should Bart stay?" The doctor weighed his words carefully before he spoke. "Bart will be what we call a control, Mrs. Stanton. Since the boys are genetically identical, they should have been a great deal alike, in personality as well as in body, if it hadn't been for Martin's accident. In other words, our tests of Bart will tell us what Martin should be like. That way we can tell just how much and in what way Martin deviates from what he should ideally be. Do you understand?" Yes, I see. All right, Doctor, whatever you say." After Mrs. Stanton had left, the psychiatrist sat quietly in his chair and stared thoughtfully at his desktop for several minutes. Then, making his decision, he picked up a small book that lay on his desk and looked up a number in Arlington, Virginia. He punched out the number on his phone, and when the face appeared on his screen, he said, "Hello, Sidney. Busy right now?" "Not particularly. Not for a few minutes. What's up?" "I have a very interesting case out here that I'd like to talk to you about. Do you happen to have a telepath who's strong enough to take a meshing with an insane mind? If my suspicions are correct, I will need a man with an absolutely impregnable sense of identity, because he's going to get into the weirdest situation I've ever come across." End of Chapter 13. Of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anything You Can Do. Chapter 14. The Knipe squatted, brooding, in his underground nest, waiting for the special crystallization process to take place in the sodium-gold alloy that was forming in the reactor. How long, he wondered. He was not thinking of the complex crystallization reaction. He knew the timing of that to a fraction of a second. His dark thoughts were, instead, focused inwardly upon himself. How long would it be before he would be able to construct the communicator that would span the light-years of intervening distance, and put him in touch with his own race again? How long would it be before he could again hold discourse with reasonable beings? How much longer would he have to be stranded on this planet, surrounded by an insane society composed of degraded, insane beings? The work was going incredibly slowly. He had known at the beginning that his knowledge of the basic arts required to build a communicator was incomplete, but he had not realized just how painfully inadequate it was. Time after time, his instruments had simply refused to function because of some basic flaw in their manufacture, some flaw that an expert in that field could have pointed out at once. Time after time, equipment had had to be rebuilt almost from the beginning. And time after time, only cut-and-try methods were available for correcting his errors. Not even his prodigious and accurate memory could hold all the information that was necessary for the work, and there were no reference tapes available, of course. They had all been destroyed when his ship had crashed. He had long since given up any attempt to understand the functioning of the mad pseudo-civilization that surrounded him. He was quite certain that the beings he had seen could not possibly be the real rulers of this society, but he had no inkling, as yet, as to who the real rulers were. As to where they were, that question seemed a little easier to answer. It was highly probable that they were out in space, on the asteroids that his instruments had detected when he was dropping in toward this planet so many years before. He had made an error, then, in not landing in the belt, but at no time since had he experienced the emotion of regret, or wished he had done differently. Both thoughts would have been incomprehensible to the Knipe. He had made an error. The circumstances had been checked and noted. He would not make that error again. What further action could be taken by a logical mind? None. The past was immutable and unchangeable. It existed only as a memory in his own mind, and there was no way to change that indelible record, even had the Knipe wished to do so insane a thing. Surely, he thought, the real rulers must know of his existence. He had tried, by his every action, to show that he was a reasoning, intelligent, and civilized being. Why, then, had they taken no action? There was, of course, the possibility that the rulers cared very little for their subjects here on Earth, that they ignored what went on most of the time. Still, it would seem that they would recognize the actions of one of their own kind and take steps to investigate. He was still not absolutely certain about Colonel Walther Mannheim. Was he a real person, or merely an underling? The information on the man was pitifully small. It would, of course, be possible to wait, to see how Colonel Walther Mannheim behaved if and when he discovered the Knipe's nest. But if he had not discovered it after all these years, and the information indicated that he had been looking almost since the first, then it was unlikely that he was a real person, in which case it would be dangerous to allow him to find the nest. No, the best plan of action would be to go to Colonel Walther Mannheim first. End of Chapter 14. Of Anything You Can Do, by Randall Garrett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anything You Can Do, Chapter 15. Pock pock ping, pock pock ping, pock pock ping, pock pock ping. The action around the handball court was beautiful to watch. The robot mechanism behind Bart Stanton would fire out a ball at random intervals, ranging from a tenth to a quarter of a second, bouncing them off the wall in a random pattern. Stanton would retrieve the ball before it hit the ground and bounce it off the wall again to strike the target on the moving robot. Stanton had to work against a machine. No ordinary human being could have given him any competition. Pock pock ping, pock pock ping, pock pock plunk. One miss, Stanton said to himself, but he fielded the next one nicely and slammed it home. Pock pock ping. The physical therapist, who was standing to one side, well out of the way of those hard-slammed, fast-moving drives, glanced at his watch. It was almost time. Pock pock ping. The machine, having delivered its last ball, shut itself off with a smug click. Stanton turned away from the handball court and walked toward the physical therapist, who was holding out a robe for him. "That was good, Bart," he said. "Real good." "One miss," Stanton said as he shrugged into the robe. "Yeah, your timing was off a shade there, I guess. It's hard for me to tell till I look at the slow-motion photographs. Your arms and hands are just blurs to me when they're moving that fast. But you managed to chop another 10 seconds off your previous record, anyway." Stanton looked at him. "You reset the timer again," he said accusingly. But there was a grin on his face. The PT man grinned back. "Yup. Come on, step into the mummy case." He waved toward the narrow niche in the wall of the court, a niche just big enough to hold a standing man. Stanton stepped in, and various instrument pickups came out of the walls and touched him at various points on his body. Hidden machines recorded his heartbeat, his blood pressure, his brain activity, his muscular tension, his breathing, and several other factors. After a minute, the PT man said, "Okay, Bart, that's it. Let's hit the steam box." Stanton stepped out of the niche and accompanied the therapist to another room, where he took off the robe again and sat down on the small stool inside an ordinary steam box. The box closed, leaving his head free, and the box began to fill with steam. "Did I ever tell you just what it is that I don't like about that machine?" Stanton asked as the therapist draped a heavy towel around his head. "Nope. Didn't know you had any gripe. What is it?" "You can't gloat after you beat it. You can't walk over and pat it on the shoulder and say, 'Well, better luck next time, old man.' It isn't a good loser, and it isn't a bad loser. The damn thing doesn't even know it lost, and even if it did, it wouldn't care." "Yeah, I see what you mean," said the PT man, chuckling. "You beat the pants off it, and what do you get? Nothing. Not even a case of the sulks out of it." "Exactly. And what's worse, I know perfectly good and well that it's only half trying. The stupid gadget could beat me easily if you just turned that knob over a little more." "Yeah, sure. But you're not competing against the machine anyway," the therapist said. "What you're doing, you're competing against yourself, trying to beat your own record." "I know. And what happens when I can't do that anymore either?" Stanton asked. "I can't just go on getting better and better forever. I've got limits, you know." "Sure," said the therapist easily. "So does anybody. So does a golf player, for instance. You take a golf player. He goes out and practices by himself to try to beat his own record." "Bunk. Hogwash. The real fun in any game is beating someone else. The big kick in golf is winning over the other guy in a twosome." "How about crossword puzzles or solitaire?" "When you solve a crossword puzzle, you've beaten the guy who made up the puzzle. When you play solitaire, you're playing against the laws of chance, and that can become pretty boring unless there's money on it. And in that case, you're actually trying to beat the guy who's betting against you. What I'd like to do is get out on the golf course with someone else and do my best and then lose. Honestly." "With a handicap," the therapist began. Then he grinned weakly and stopped. On the golf course, Stanton was impossibly good. It had taken him a little while to get the knack of it, but as soon as he got control of his club and knew the reactions of the ball, his score started plummeting. Now it was so low as to be almost ridiculous. One long drive to the green and one putt to the cup. An easy 36 strokes for 18 holes. An occasional hole-in-one sometimes brought his score down below that. An occasional worm cast or stray wind sometimes brought it up. "Sure," said Stanton, "a handicap. What kind of a handicap do you want me to give you to induce you to make a $50 bet on a handball game with me?" The physical therapist could imagine himself trying to get under one of Stanton's lightning-like returns. The thought of what would happen to his hand if he were accidentally to catch one made him wince. "We wouldn't even be playing the same game," said Stanton. The therapist stepped back and looked at Stanton. "You know," he said puzzledly, "you sound bitter." "Sure I'm bitter," Stanton said. "All I ever get is just exercise. All the fun has gone out of it." He sighed and grinned. There was no point in upsetting the PT man. "I guess I'll just have to stick to cards and chess if I want competition. Speed and strength don't help anything if I'm holding 2 pair against 3 of a kind." Before the therapist could say anything, the door opened and a tall, lean man stepped into the foggy air of the room. "You are broiling a lobster?" he asked the PT man blandly. "Steaming a clam," the therapist corrected. "When he's done, I'll pound him to chowder." "Excellent. I came for a clam bake." "You're early then, George," Stanton said. He didn't feel much in the mood for lightness, and the appearance of Dr. Yoritomo did nothing to improve his humor. George Yoritomo beamed broadly, crinkling up his narrow, heavy-lidded eyes. "Ah, a talking clam. Excellent. How much longer does this fine specimen of clamhood have to cook?" he asked the PT man. "About 23 more minutes." "Excellent," said Dr. Yoritomo. "Would you be so good as to return at the end of that time?" The therapist opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again and said, "Sure, Doc. I can get some other stuff done. I'll see you in 23 minutes. But don't let him out of there till I get back." He went out through the far door. After the door closed, Dr. Yoritomo pulled up a chair and sat down. "There have been new developments," he said, "as you may have surmised." The physical therapist, like many other of the personnel around the Institute, knew of Stanton's abilities, but he didn't know the purpose of the long series of operations that had made him what he was. Such persons knew about Stanton himself, but they knew nothing of any connection with the knipe, although they might suspect. And all of them kept their knowledge and their suspicions to themselves. "I guessed," Stanton said. "What is it, George?" He flexed his muscles under the caress of the hot, moist currents in the box. He wondered why it was so important that the psychologist interrupt him while he was relaxing after strenuous exercise. Yoritomo looked excited in spite of his attempt to be calm. And yet Stanton knew that, whatever it wasn't anything tremendously urgent, or Dr. Yoritomo would be acting a great deal differently. Yoritomo leaned forward in his chair, his thin lips in an excited smile, his black irised eyes sparkling. "I had to come tell you. The sheer, utter beauty of it is too much to contain. 3 times in a row was almost absolute, Bart. The probability that our hypotheses were correct was computed as straight 9s to 7 decimals. But now, the 4th time, straight 9s to 12 decimals." Stanton lifted an eyebrow. "Your oriental calm is deserting you, George. I'm not reading you." Yoritomo's smile became broader. "Ah, sorry. I refer to the theory we have been discussing, about the peculiar mentality of our friend the Knipe. You remember?" Stanton remembered. After 6 years of watching the recorded actions of the Knipe, Dr. Yoritomo had evolved a theory about the kind of mentality that lay behind the 4 baleful violet eyes in that snouted alien head. In order that his theory be validated, it was necessary that the theory be able to predict, in broad terms, the future actions of the Knipe. Evidently, that proof had now come. The psychologist was smiling and rubbing his long, bony hands together. For Dr. George Yoritomo, that was almost the equivalent of hysterical excitement. "We have been able to predict the behavior of the Knipe," he said, "for the 4th time in succession." "Great," Stanton said. "Congratulations, George. But how does that fit in with the rule you once told me about? You know, the one about experimental animals." "Ah, yes," Yoritomo said, nodding his head agreeably. "The Harvard Law of Animal Behavior. A genetically standardized strain, under precisely controlled laboratory conditions, when subjected to carefully calibrated stimuli, will behave as it damned well pleases. Yes, very true." He held up a cautionary finger. "But an animal could not do otherwise, could it? Only as it pleases. Could it do anything else? It could not please to behave as something it is not, could it?" "Draw me a picture," Stanton said. "What I mean," Yoritomo said, "is that any organism is limited in its choice of behavior. A hamster, for example, cannot choose to behave in the manner of a rhesus monkey. A dog cannot choose to react as a mouse would react. If I prick a white mouse with a needle, it may squeal or bite or jump, but it will not bark. Never. Nor will it, under any circumstances, leap to a trapeze, hang by its tail, and chatter curses at me. Never." Stanton chuckled, but he didn't comment. "By observing an organism's reactions," the psychologist continued, "one can begin to see a pattern. After long enough observation, the pattern almost approaches certainty. If, for instance, I tell you that I put an armful of hay into a certain animal's enclosure, and that the animal trotted over, ate the hay, and brayed, then you will be able to tell me with reasonable certainty whether or not the animal had long ears. Do you see?" "Sure, but you haven't been able to pinpoint the Knife's activities that easily yet, have you?" Stanton asked. "Ah, no," said Yoritomo, "not at all. That was merely an analogy, and we must not make the mistake of carrying an analogy too far. The more intelligent a creature is, the greater, in general, is its scope of action. The Knife is far from being so simple as a monkey or a hamster. On the other hand," he smiled widely, showing bright white teeth, "he is not so bright as a human being." "What?" Stanton looked at him skeptically. "I wouldn't say he was exactly stupid, George. What about all those prize gadgets of his?" He blinked. "Wipe the sweat off my forehead, will you? It's running into my eyes." Dr. Yoritomo wiped with a towel as he continued. "Ah, yes. He is quite capable in that respect, my friend. Quite capable. That is because of his great memory. At once his finest asset and his greatest curse." He draped the towel around Stanton's head again and stepped back, his face unsmiling. "Imagine having a near-perfect memory, Bart." Stanton's jaw muscles tightened a little before he spoke. "I think I'd like it," he said. Yoritomo shrugged slightly. "Perhaps you would. But it would most certainly not be the asset you think. Look at it very soberly, my friend. The most difficult teaching job in the world is the attempt to teach an organism something that that organism already knows. True? Yes. If a man already knows the shape of the earth, it will do you no good to teach him. If he knows, for example, that the earth is flat, but round like a pancake, your contention that it is round like a ball will make no impression upon his mind whatever. He knows, you see. He knows. Now, imagine a race with a perfect memory, a memory that never fades, a memory in which each bit of data is as bright and as fresh as the moment it was imprinted, and as readily available as the data stored in a robot's mind. It is, in effect, a robotic memory. If you put false data into the memory banks of a mathematical computer, such as telling it that the square of 2 is 5, you cannot correct that error simply by telling it the true fact that the square of 2 is 4. No. First, you must remove the erroneous data. Not so?" "Agreed," Stanton said. "Very good. Then let us look at the Knipe race, wherever it was spawned in this universe. Let us look at the race a long time back, way back when they first became Knipe sapiens. Back when they first developed a true language. Each little Knipe child, as it is born or hatched or budded, whatever it is they do, is taught as rapidly as possible all the things it must know in order to survive. And once a little Knipelet is taught a thing, it knows. That knowledge is there, it is permanent, and it can be brought instantly to the fore. And if it is taught a falsehood, then it cannot be taught the truth. You see?" Stanton thought about it. "Well, yes. But eventually there are going to be cases where reality doesn't jibe with what he's been taught, aren't there? And wouldn't cold reality force a change? Ah, in some cases, yes. In most, no, said Yoritomo. Look, suppose one of these primordial nipes runs across a tiger, or whatever large carnivore passes for a tiger on their home planet. This nipe, let us say, has never seen a tiger before, so he does not observe that this particular tiger is old, ill, and weak. It is, as a matter of fact, on its last legs. Our primordial nipe hits it on the head, and it drops dead. It drags the body home for the family to feed upon. "How did you kill it, Papa?" "Why, it was the simplest thing in the world, my child. I walked up to it, bashed it firmly on the noggin, and it died. That is the way to kill tigers." Yoritomo smiled. "It is also a good way to kill nipes, eh?" He took the towel and wiped Stanton's brow again. "The error," he continued, "was made when Papa Nipe made the generalization from one tiger to all tigers. If tigers were rare, this erroneous bit of lore might be passed on for many generations, unchecked, and spread through the Nipe community as time passed. Those who did learn that most tigers are not conquered by walking up to them and hitting them on the noggin undoubtedly died before they could pass this new bit of information on. Then, perhaps, one day a Nipe survived the ordeal. His mind now contained conflicting information which must be resolved. He knows that tigers are killed in this way. He also knows that this one was not so obliging as to die. What is wrong? Ha! He has the solution. Plainly, this particular beast was not a tiger." "How does he explain that to the others?" Stanton asked. "What does he tell his children?" Yoritomo asked rhetorically. "Why, first he tells them how tigers are killed. You walk up to one and bash it on the head. And then he warns his little nipelets that there is an animal around that looks just like a tiger, but it is not a tiger. One should not make the mistake of thinking it is a tiger, or one will get oneself badly hurt. Now, since the only way to tell the true tiger from the false is to give it a hit on the head, and since that test may prove rather injurious, if not absolutely fatal, to the Nipe who tries it, it follows that one is better off if one scrupulously avoids all animals that look like tigers. You see?" "Yeah," said Stanton. "Some Snarks are Boojums." "Exactly. Thank you for that allusion," Yoritomo said with a smile. "I must remember to use it in my report." "It seems to me to follow," Stanton said musingly, "that there would inevitably be some things that they'd never learn the truth about, once they had gotten the wrong idea into their heads." "Ah, indeed. Absolutely true. It is precisely that which led me to formulate my theory in the first place. How else are we to explain that the Nipe, for all his tremendous technical knowledge, is nonetheless a member of a society that is still in the ancient ritual taboo stage of development? A savage?" Yoritomo laughed softly. "As to his savagery, I think no one on Earth would disagree. But they are not the same thing. What I do mean is that the Nipe is undoubtedly the most superstitious and bigoted being on the face of this planet." There was a knock on the door of the steam room. "Yes," said Dr. Yoritomo. The physical therapist stuck his head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but the clam is done. I'll have to give him a rub-down, Doc." "Perfectly all right," Yoritomo said. "We had almost finished. Think over what I have said, eh, Bart?" "Yeah, sure, George," Stanton said abstractedly. Yoritomo left, and Stanton got up on the rub-down table and lay prone. The therapist, seeing that his patient was in no mood for conversation, proceeded with the massage in silence. Stanton lay on the table, his head pillowed in his arms, while the therapist rubbed and kneaded his muscles. The pleasant sensation formed a background for his thoughts. For the first time, Stanton was seeing the Nipe as an individual, as a person, as a thinking, feeling being. "We have a great deal in common, you and I," he thought, "except that you're a lot worse off than I am." I'm actually feeling sorry for the poor guy, Stanton thought. Which, I suppose, is a hell of a lot better than feeling sorry for myself. The only real, basic difference between us freaks is that you're more of a freak than I am. Molly O'Grady and the Colonel's lady are sisters under the skin. Where'd that come from? Something I learned in school, no doubt, like the Snarks and the Boojums. He would answer to high or to any loud cry, such as "Fry me" or "Fritter my wig." Who was that? The Snark? No. The Snark had a flavor like that of Will-o'-the-Wisp, and I must remember to distinguish those that have feathers and bite from those that have whiskers and scratch. Damn this memory of mine! Or can I even call it mine when I can't even use it? For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. Another jack-in-the-box thought popping up from nowhere. The only way I'll ever get all of this stuff straightened out in my mind is to get more information. And it doesn't look as though anyone is going to give it to me on a platter either. The Institute men seem to be awfully chary about giving information away, even to me. George even had to chase away old Rub and Pound. That feels good. Before he could talk about the Knipe. Can't blame him for that, of course. There'd be hell to pay for everyone around if the general public ever found out that the Knipe has been kept as a pet for 6 years. How many people has he killed in that time? 20? 30? How much blood does Colonel Mannheim have on his hands? Though they know not why, or for what they give, still the few must die, that many may live. I wonder whether I read all that stuff complete, or just browsed through a copy of Bartlett's quotations. Fragments. We've got to get organized around here, brother. Colonel Mannheim's puppet is going to have to cut his strings and do a Pinocchio. End of chapter 15. Of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anything You Can Do. Chapter 16. Colonel Walther Mannheim unlocked the door of his small suite of rooms in the officers' barracks. God, he was tired. It wasn't so much physical exhaustion as mental and emotional release from the tension he had been under for the preceding few hours. Or had it been years? He dropped his heavy briefcase on a nearby chair, took off his cap, and dropped it on the briefcase. He stood there for a moment, looking tiredly around. Everything was in order as usual. He seldom came to Government City anymore. 20 or so visits in the last 10 years, and only a dozen of them had been long enough to force him to spend the night in his old suite at the World Police Headquarters at the southern end of the island. He didn't like to stay in Government City. It made him uneasy, being this close to the Knipe's underground nest. The Knipe had too many taps into government communication channels, too many ways of seeing and hearing what went on here in the nerve center of civilization. One of the most difficult parts of this whole operation had been the careful balancing of information flow through those channels that the Knipe had tapped. To stop using them would betray immediately to that alien mind that his taps had been detected. The information flow must go on as usual. There was no way to censor the information either, although it was known that the Knipe relied on them for planning his raids. But since there was no way of knowing, even after years of observation, what sort of thing the Knipe would be wanting next, there was no way of knowing which information should be removed from the tapped channels. And most certainly removing all information about every possible material that the Knipe might want would make him even more suspicious than simply shutting down the channels altogether. To shut them down would only indicate that the human government had detected his taps. To censor them heavily would indicate that a trap was being laid. It was even impossible to censor out news about the Knipe. That, too, would have invited suspicion. So a special corps of men had been set up, a group whose sole job was to investigate every raid of the Knipe. Every raid produced a flurry of activity by this special group. They rushed out to look over the scene of the raid, prowled around, and did everything that might be expected of an investigative body. Their reports were sent in over the usual channels. All the actual data they came up with was sent straight through the normal channels, but the conclusions they reached from that data were not. Always, in spite of everything, the messages indicated that the police were as baffled as before. All other information relating to the Knipe went through special channels known to be untapped by the Knipe. And yet there was no way to be absolutely certain of the sum total of the information that the Knipe received. Believing, as he did, in the existence of real people, he would necessarily assume that their communication systems were hidden from him, and the more difficult they were to find, the more certain he would be that they existed. And it was impossible to know what information the Knipe picked up when he was out on a raid, away from the spying devices that had been hidden in his tunnels. Mannheim walked across the small living room to the sideboard that stood against one wall and opened a door. Fresh ice, soda, and a bottle of scotch were waiting for him. He took one of the 10-ounce glasses, dropped in 3 of the hard frozen cubes of ice, added a precisely measured ounce and a half of scotch, and filled the glass to within an inch of the brim with soda. Holding the glass in one hand, he walked around the little apartment, checking everything with a sort of automatic abstractedness. The air conditioner was pouring sweet, cool, fresh air into the room. The windows, heavy, thick slabs of paraglass welded directly into the wall, admitted the light from the courtyard outside, but admitted nothing else. There was no need for them to open, because of the air conditioning. A century before, some buildings still had fire escapes running down their outsides, but modern fireproofing had rendered such anachronisms unnecessary. But his mind was only partly on his surroundings. He went into the bedroom, sat down on the edge of the bed, took a long drink from the cold glass in his hand, and then put it on the nightstand. Absently, he began pulling off his boots. His thoughts were on the executive session he had attended that afternoon. "How much longer do you think, Colonel?" "A few weeks, sir, perhaps less." "There was another raid in Miami, Colonel. Another man died. We could have prevented that death, Colonel. We could have prevented a great many deaths in the past 6 years." And what answer was there to that? The Executive Council knew that the deaths were preventable in only one way, by killing the Knipe. And they had long ago agreed that the knowledge in that alien mind was worth the sacrifice. But as he had known would happen when they made the decision 6 years before, there were some of them who had, inevitably, weakened. Not all, not even a majority, but a minority that was becoming stronger. It had been, to a great degree, Mannheim's arguments that had convinced them then, and now they were tending to shift the blame for their decision to Mannheim's shoulders. Most of the executives were tough-minded, realistic men. They were not going to step out now unless there were good reason for it. But if the subtle undercutting of the vacillating minority weakened Mannheim's own resolve, or if he failed to give solid, well-reasoned answers to their questions, then the whole project would begin to crumble rapidly. He had not directly answered the executive who had pointed out that many lives could have been saved if the Knipe had been killed 6 years ago. There was no use in fighting back on such puerile terms. "Gentlemen, within a few weeks, we will be ready to send Stanton in after the Knipe. If that fails, we can blast him out of his stronghold within minutes afterwards. But if we stop now, if we allow our judgment to be colored at this point, then all those who have died in the past 6 years will have died in vain." He had gone on, exploring and explaining the ramifications of the plans for the next few weeks, but he had carefully kept it on the same level. It had been an emotional sort of speech, but it had been purposely so, in answer to the sort of emotionalism that the weakening minority had attempted to use on him. Men had died, yes. But what of that? Men had died before for far less worthwhile causes. And men, do what they will die eventually. In the back of his mind, he had recalled the battle cry of some sergeant of the old United States Marines during an early 20th century war. As he led his men over the top, he had shouted, "Come on, you sons of bitches! Do you want to live forever?" But Mannheim hadn't mentioned it aloud to the Executive Council. Had he pointed out that 10,000 times as many people had died during the same period through preventable accidents, that would not have been the effect he wanted. These particular men had died for this particular purpose. They had not asked to die. They had not known that they were being sacrificed. None of them could be said to have died a hero's death. They had died simply because they were in a particular place at a particular time. They had been allowed to die for a specific purpose. To abort that purpose at this time would be to make their deaths retroactively murder. Mannheim put his head on the pillow and lifted his feet up on the bed. All he wanted was a few minutes of relaxation. He'd get ready for sleep later. He pressed the control button on the bed frame that lifted the head of the bed up so that he was in a semi-reclining position. He picked up his drink and took a second long pull from it. Then he touched the phone switch and put the receiver to his ear. "Beta, Beta," he said when he heard the tone. He heard the hum, and he knew that the ultra-private phone on the desk of Dr. Farnsworth in St. Louis was signaling. Then Farnsworth's voice came over the linkage. "F here." "M here," Mannheim replied. Then he asked guardedly, "Any sign of our boy?" "None." "Keep on him," Mannheim said. "Let me know immediately." "Will do. Any further?" "No. Carry on." Mannheim cut off the phone. Where the hell had Stanton disappeared to, and why? He had wanted to bring the young man to Government City to show him off before the executives. It would have helped. But Stanton had disappeared. Mannheim was well aware that Stanton had been in the habit of leaving the Institute for long walks during the evenings, but this was the first time he had been gone for 24 hours. And even Yoritomo, that master psychologist, had been unable to give any solid reason for Stanton's disappearance. "You must remember, my dear Colonel," Yoritomo had said, "our young Mr. Stanton is a great deal more complex in his thinking than is our friend the Knipe." A hell of a job for a police officer, Mannheim thought to himself. I know where the criminal is, but I have to hunt for the only cop on Earth who can arrest him. He drained his glass, put it on the nightstand, and closed his eyes to think. An operator on duty at the spy screens that watched every move of the Knipe while he was in the tunnels underneath Government City thumbed down a switch and said, "All stations alert. Subject is moving southward toward exit, carrying raiding equipment." It was all that was necessary. The Knipe could not be followed after he left his lair, but the proper groups would be standing by. Somewhere the Knipe would hit and raid again. Somewhere there were human lives in danger. All anyone could do was wait. Cautiously and carefully, the Knipe lifted his head out of the cool salt water of the Hudson River, near the point where it widened into New York Harbor, still so called after the city that had been the greatest on the North American continent before the violence of a sun bomb had demolished it forever. He looked around carefully to get his bearings, then submerged again. The opening into the ancient sewer was nearby. Once into that network, he would know exactly where he was heading. It had taken weeks to find his way around within the unexplored maze of the old sewers, and he had been uncertain whether they would lead him to the place he intended to visit, but luck had been with him. Now he knew exactly where he wanted to go, and exactly what he would find there. He had avoided Government City itself since his first appearance there, shortly after his arrival, just as he had, as much as possible, avoided ever striking in the same place more than once. But now that it had become necessary, He went about his work with the same cool determination that had always marked his activities. He knew his destination, too. He knew the 2 rooms thoroughly, having explored them carefully and gone away undetected. And now that he knew the one he sought was in those rooms, he was ready to make his final investigation of the man. He swam on through the utter blackness of the brackish water until his head broke surface again. Then he went on along the great conduits that were above the level of the sea. Captain Davidson Greer sat in the gun tower that overlooked the officers' barracks and the courtyard surrounding the 5-story building. He was a tall, solidly built man in his early 30s, with dark gray-green eyes and dark blonde hair. He didn't particularly care for gun tower duty, but this sort of thing couldn't be left to anyone who was not in on the secret of the Knipe. As long as Colonel Mannheim was here in Government City, there would be special officers guarding him instead of the usual guard contingent. Not that Captain Greer was actually expecting the Knipe to make any attempt on the Colonel's life. That was too remote to be worried about. But the gun towers had been erected 50 or more years before, because there were always those who wanted to attempt assassination. Officers of the World Police had not enjoyed great popularity during the Reconstruction period after the Holocaust. The petty potentates who had set themselves up as autocratic rulers in various spots over the earth had quite often decided that the best way to get the WP off their backs was to kill someone, and quite often that someone was a police officer. Disgruntled nationalists and fanatics of all kinds had tried at various times to kill one officer or another. The protection was needed then. But now there were occasional assassins who attempted to invade World Police headquarters, but they were usually stopped long before they got into the enclosure itself. Still, there was always the chance. There had been, in the past few years, an undercurrent of rebellion all over Earth because of the Knipe. The monster hadn't been killed, and there were those who screamed that the failure was due to the inefficiency of the police. One attempt had already been made on the life of a Major Thorensen, because he had failed to get the Knipe after a raid in Leopoldville. The would-be assassin had been cut down just before he threw a grenade that would have killed 6 men. Captain Greer had been assigned to make sure that no such attempt would succeed with Colonel Mannheim. He could see the length of the hallway that led to Colonel Mannheim's suite. The hallway had been purposely designed for watching from the gun tower. To one who was inside, it looked like an ordinary hallway, stretching down the length of the building. But it was walled with a special plastic that, while opaque to visible light, was perfectly transparent to infrared. To the ordinary unaided eye, the walls of the building presented a blank face to the gun tower, but to the eye of an infrared scope, the hallways of all 5 floors looked as though they were long, glass-enclosed terraces. And those walls were neither the ferro-concrete of the main building nor the pressure glass of the windows, but ordinary, heavy-gauge plastic. To the bullets that could be spewed forth from the muzzle of the heavy-caliber, high-powered machine gun in the tower, those walls were practically non-existent. Captain Greer surveyed the hallways with his infrared binoculars. Nothing. The halls were empty. He lowered the binoculars and lit a cigarette. Then he put his eyes to the aiming scope of the gun and swiveled the muzzle a little. The aiming scope showed nothing either. He leaned back and exhaled a cloud of smoke. Colonel Mannheim blinked and looked at the ceiling. It took him a minute to reorient himself. Then he grinned rather sheepishly, realizing that he had dozed off with his clothes on. Even worse, the pressure at his hip told him that he hadn't even bothered to take his sidearm off. He sat up and swung his feet to the floor, then glanced at his wrist. 3 in the morning. And the moral of that, my dear Walther, he told himself, is that a tired man should put on his pajama first before he lies down and drinks a scotch. He stood up. Might as well put his pajamas on and get to bed. He would have to be back in St. Louis by 10 in the morning, so he ought to get as much sleep as possible. The phone chimed. He scooped it up and became instantly awake as he heard the voice of Captain Greer from the gun tower that faced the outer wall. "Colonel, the Knipe is just outside the wall of your apartment, in the hallway. I have him in my sights." He was trying to stay calm, Mannheim could tell by his voice, but he rattled the words off with machine-gun rapidity. Mannheim thought rapidly. Whatever the Knipe was up to, it wouldn't include planning a bomb or anything that might kill anyone accidentally. If there was a life in danger, it was his own, and the danger would come from the Knipe's hands, not from any device or weapon. He was thankful that it was Captain Greer up in that tower, not an ordinary guard who would have fired the instant he saw the alien through the infrared transparent walls. Even so, he knew that the captain's fingers must be tightening on those triggers. No human being could do otherwise with that monster in his sights. Mannheim spoke very calmly and deliberately. "Captain, listen very carefully. Do not, I repeat, do not, under any circumstances whatever, fire that gun. Understand?" "Yes, sir." "What's he doing?" "I can't tell, sir. He has some sort of gadget in his hands, but he just seems to be squatting there." "At the door?" "No. To the left of it, at the wall." "You have your cameras going?" "Yes, sir." "All right. Get everything that happens. Under no circumstances shoot or give the alarm, even if he kills me. Let him go. I don't think that will happen, but if it does, let him go. I think I can talk to him. I don't think there's much danger. I'm going to leave the phone open so you can record everything, and—" There was a muffled noise from the living room. He heard Captain Greer's gasp as he turned. He could see through the bedroom door to the wall of the living room. A large section of the ferro-concrete wall had sagged away and collapsed, having suddenly lost its tensile strength. On the top of the rubble, frozen for a long instant, stood the Knipe, watching with those four glowing violet eyes. Mannheim let go the phone and turned to face the monster, and in that instant he realized his mistake. The Knipe stared at the human being. Was this, at last, a real person? It was surprising that the man should be awake. Only a minute before, the instruments had shown him to be in the odd cataleptic state that these creatures lapsed into periodically, similar to, but not identical with, his own rest state. And yet he was now awake, and fully dressed. Surely that indicated— And then the man turned, and the Knipe saw the weapon in the holster at his waist. There was a blinding instant of despair as he realized that his hopes had been shattered, and he launched himself across the room. Colonel Mannheim's hand darted toward the gun at his hip. It was purely reflex action. Even as he did it, he was aware that he would never get the weapon out in time to bring it to bear on the onrushing monster, and he was content that it should be so. 25 minutes later, the Knipe, after carefully licking off the fingers of his first pair of hands, went back into the hallway and headed down toward the sewers again. The emotion he felt is inexpressible in human terms. Although he had not wished to kill the man, it cannot be said that the Knipe felt contrition. Although he had had no desire to harm the family, if any of the late Colonel Mannheim, it cannot be said that the Knipe felt sadness or compassion. Nor again, although his stomach churned and his body felt sluggish and heavy, can it be said that he felt any regret for what he had done. That is not to say that he felt no emotion. He did. His emotions were as strong and as deep as those of a very sensitive human being. His emotions could bring him pain, and they could bring him pleasure. They could crush him or exalt him. His emotions were just as real and as effective as any human emotions. But they were not human emotions. They were emotions, but not human emotions. It is impossible to render into any human terms the simple statement, "The knight felt that he had properly rendered homage to a validly slain foe." That cannot even begin to indicate the emotion the knight felt as he moved down toward the sewer and escape. Captain Davidson Greer, his eyes staring with glassy hatred through the infrared gun sight, was registering a very human emotion. His trigger fingers were twitching spasmodically, squeezing, squeezing, squeezing. But his fingers were not on the triggers. End of chapter 16. Of Anything You Can Do, by Randall Garrett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anything You Can Do, Chapter 17. "It is not your fault, Bart," said George Yoritomo softly. "You had a perfect right to go." Bart Stanton clenched his fists and turned suddenly to face the Japanese psychologist. "Sure. Hell yes. We're not discussing my rights, George. We're discussing my criminal stupidity. I had the right to leave here any time I wanted to, sure. But I didn't have the right to exercise that right, if that makes any sense to you." "It makes sense," Yoritomo agreed, "but it is not the way to look at it. You could not have been with the Colonel every minute of every day. There was no way of knowing—" "Of course not!" Stanton cut in angrily. "But I should have been there this time. He wanted me there, and I was gone. If I'd been there, he'd be alive at this moment." "Possibly," Yoritomo said, and then again, possibly not. "Sit down over there on your bed, my young friend, and listen to me. Sit! That's it. Take a deep breath. Hold it, and relax. I want your ears functioning when I talk to you. That's better. Now, I do not know where you went. That is your business. All you—" "I went to Denver," Stanton said. "And you found?" "Nothing," Stanton said. "Absolutely nothing." "What were you looking for?" "I don't know. Something about my past. Something about myself. I don't know." "Ah, you went to look up your family. You were trying to fill the holes in your memory, eh?" "Yes." "And you did not succeed." "No, no. There wasn't anything there that I didn't remember. In general, I mean. I found the files in the Bureau of Statistics. I know how my father died now, and how my mother died, and what happened to my brother. But all that didn't tell me anything. I'm still looking for something, and I don't know what it is. I was stupid to have gone. I suppose I should have asked you or Dr. Farnsworth or the Colonel." "But you thought we wouldn't answer," Yoritomo said. "I guess that's about it. I should have asked you." Yoritomo shook his head. "Not necessarily. It was actually better that you looked for yourself. Besides, we could not have given you any answer if you yourself do not know the question. We still can't." "I have a feeling," Stanton said, "that you know the question as well as the answer." "Perhaps, perhaps not. But there are some things that every man must find out for himself. You were right to do as you did. If you had asked Colonel Mannheim for permission, he would have let you go. He would not have asked you to go to Government City with him. That's the whole damn trouble," Stanton snapped. "I'm the star boarder around here, the indispensable man, so I'm babied and I'm coddled, and when I goof off, I'm patted on the back." "And just how did you goof off?" Yoritomo asked. "I should have been there, ready to go with the Colonel." "Very well. Suppose you had gone. Do you think you could have saved his life? He could have saved his own life if he wanted to. Instead, he specifically ordered the guard not to shoot under any circumstances. If you had been there, the results would have been the same. He would have forbidden you to do anything at all. The time is not yet ripe for you to face the knipe. You would not have been able to protect him without disobeying his orders." "I might have done just that," said Stanton. Yoritomo was suddenly angry. "Then it is better that you were in Denver, young fool. Colonel Walther Mannheim believed that no single human life is worth the loss of the knowledge in that alien's mind. He proved that by sacrificing his own life when that became necessary. I'd like to think that I would have done the same thing myself. I am certain Dr. Farnsworth would. We would rather all be dead than allow that fund of data to be lost to the rest of humanity." But who will carry on with him dead?" Stanton asked. "He was the one who coordinated everything. You and Farnsworth aren't cut out for that sort of thing. Nor am I." "No," Yoritomo said, "but that has already been taken care of. Mannheim had a replacement ready. A message is being sent out in Mannheim's name, since we are keeping the Colonel's death secret for the time being. You are the only indispensable man, Stanton. The rest of us can easily be replaced. The lives of dozens of human beings have been sacrificed. 5 years of your own life have been sacrificed to put you in the right place at the right time. And the job you are to do does not and never has included acting as bodyguard for Colonel Mannheim or anyone else. Understand?" Stanton nodded slowly. "I understand, George. I understand." End of Chapter 17. Of Anything You Can Do by Randall Garrett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Anything You Can Do. Chapter 18. The detective pushed his way out of the crowded courtroom before the rest of the crowd started to move. The members of the jury were still filing in, and he knew that no one else would leave the room until the verdict was in. He didn't care. He knew what the verdict ought to be. He knew also that juries had occasionally been swayed by histrionics on the part of the defense counsel, and had been persuaded to free guilty men. He knew, too, that prosecutors had railroaded innocent men. But such things as that didn't happen often in the Belt. A man doesn't live too long in the Belt unless he's capable of recognizing truth when he sees it. But even if the wrong verdict had been brought in, there would have been nothing he could do about it now. He had done his part. He had done everything he could. He had brought them in. He had testified. All the rest of it was up to the jury and the court, those two enigmatic halves of justice and judgment. The point was that this was the perfect time to leave the courtroom. When he reached his office, he could if he wanted, and he thought ruefully he probably would want to, in spite of his pretended indifference, call up to find out what the verdict had been. But during these few moments all eyes were on the jury box. No one was watching who left quietly by the side door of the big courtroom. He moved silently and with assurance in the fractional G field of the planetoid. One of the uniformed guards looked at him and smiled, throwing him an informal salute. The detective returned both. "If any of those news reporters ask which way I went," he said amiably, "tell 'em I went that-a-way." He gestured over his shoulder with a thumb. "I ain't even seen you, Mr. Martin," said the guard. The detective waved his thanks and kept going. It wasn't that he disliked newsmen. Most of them were fairly intelligent, pleasant people. But he didn't want to be asked any questions right now. He had given them interviews aplenty during the trial, and they could use those, now that the end of the trial had lifted the news ban. They had plenty of quotations from Stan Martin without asking him what he thought of the verdict itself. 10 minutes later, he was in his own office in the Lloyd's area. Helen, his secretary, was just cutting off the phone as he walked into the outer office. She flashed him a big smile. "They just gave the verdict, Mr. Martin. Guilty all the way down the line. Conspiracy, extortion, kidnapping, and all the others. The only not guilty verdict was a minor one. They decided that Hedgepeth wasn't involved in the actual kidnapping itself, and therefore wasn't guilty of the physical assault of the guard." "They're probably right," the detective said. "But, as you said, it's a minor point. It doesn't much matter whether he was physically present at the time the boy was taken or not. He was certainly in on the plot. He paused, frowning. "That's over and done with, except for a possible appeal, and it's unlikely that that would involve us anyway. Get Mr. Pelham on the phone, will you? I'll take it in my office." "The Morton case?" she asked. "Yeah. There's something fishy about the wreck of the spaceship Morton, and I want Pelham to let me work on it." He went on into his office and had barely sat down when the phone hummed. "Yes?" he said, depressing the switch. "Mr. Ben Heim would like to speak to you, sir," Helen said formally. "Oh?" In order to have gotten here so quickly, Ben Heim, too, must have left before the verdict was delivered. He was hardly more than a minute behind the detective. And that was unusual in a man who was waiting at the trial of the kidnappers of his own son. Still, Moishe Ben Heim was an unusual man. "Tell him to come right on in," the detective said. "Oh, and Helen, hold off on that Pelham call for a little while." He didn't want to be talking business while Ben Heim was in the office. "Yes, sir," she said. A few seconds later the door opened and Moishe Ben Heim came in. He was not a big man, but he was broad of shoulder and broad of girth, built like a wrestler. He had a heavy graying beard and wore it with a patriarchal air. He was breathing rather heavily as he came through the door, and he stopped suddenly to pull a handkerchief from his pocket. He began coughing, harsh, racking, painful coughs that shook his heavy frame. "Sorry," he said after a moment. "Damn lungs. Shouldn't try to move so fast." He wiped his lips and put the handkerchief away. The detective didn't say anything. He knew that Moishe Ben Heim had injured his lungs 18 years before. An accident in space had ruptured his spacesuit, and the explosive decompression that had resulted had almost killed him. He had saved his own life by holding the torn spot with one hand and turning up the air tank valve full blast with the other. The rough patch job had held long enough for him to get back inside his ship, but his lungs had never been the same, and his eyes were eternally bloodshot from the ruptured and distended capillaries. "I noticed you slipped out of the courtroom," he went on. "I hope you don't mind my following you." "Of course not, Mr. Ben Heim," the detective said. "Sit down." Ben Heim sat in the chair across the desk from the detective. "I didn't wait for the verdict," he said. "I knew the conviction was certain after you testified." "Thanks. My secretary got the news just before you came in. Guilty straight across the board. But your son's testimony was a lot more telling than mine." "Guilty," Ben Heim repeated with satisfaction. "Naturally. What else? I admit my son's testimony was good," he continued. "Little Shmula told his story like a little man up there in the witness box. Never looked scared, never got mixed up. But Shmula's testimony was your testimony too, Mr. Martin. If it hadn't been for you, he wouldn't be here to testify, for which I'm grateful to God." Then he leaned back and spread his hands apart in a gesture of dismissal. "But that's all over and done with," he said. "I came about a different matter." Again he paused, as if picking his words carefully. "Do you know a man named Barnabas Nguma?" "Nguma? Yes, I met him once. Why?" "He was in the courtroom today. He came to see me just before court convened." "Oh?" the detective said noncommittally. "Yes. He claims to represent an organization on Earth which has been trying to hire you for a job there. Is that right?" "That's right," the detective said warily. "What did he want with you?" "Now, that's a funny thing," Ben Heim said. "It seems that he's under the impression that you turned down his job to take on this kidnapping. Is that right?" "Not exactly," the detective said tightly. "I was working on your son's case before he and a couple of other men came out here to talk to me. But they'd written to me long before that." He wondered what Ben Heim was getting at. He didn't know any explanations to the industrialist, but on the other hand, he couldn't be impolite to him. "I see," Ben Heim said, nodding his head slowly. "Like most Earthies, Mr. Nguma is suffering under a misapprehension. He seems to think that I have some sort of hold over you, that I was the one who made you turn down his job so that you'd take my case." "Oh? Was he angry because you'd put your own selfish interests ahead of his unselfish ones?" the detective asked with a trace of hard sarcasm in his voice. "Oh, no," said Benheim. "Oh, no, not at all. He said he understood perfectly. But he wondered if, now that my boy had been returned safely, I might not put a little pressure on you to get you to take his case." "And what did you say?" Moisha Benheim scowled. "I told him exactly where he could head in. I told him that I had no power over you whatever, that I hadn't hired you at all, that I didn't even know that you were working on the case until after you rescued Shmuel. I told him that even if I held the power of life and death over you, I would never lift so much as a finger against you. I told him that it was just the other way around, in fact. I told him that you have such a power over me because of what you did for Shmuel that it is I who will jump through your hoop if ordered, not the other way around. I was quite angry." Benheim relaxed a little before going on. "Actually, I'm sorry I blew up. He's a well-meaning man, I think." "No doubt," the detective said. "Did he tell you what the job was?" "With most heart-rending particulars," said Benheim. "I was told all about how this Knipe has been killing and eating people, as if I didn't know already. But it wasn't until I heard him talk that I realized how scared people are back there on Earth. You know, Martin, we're insulated out here. We don't feel that terror, even when we read about it or see the reports on the newscasts. If everybody on Earth is as scared as that Mr. Nguma is, it's a wonder they haven't all panicked and taken to running around in circles." "As a matter of fact, Mr. Benheim," the detective said levelly, "they have begun to do just that. Mr. Nguma and his friends have been after me for a long time to take their job. They have pulled every trick they can think of, including this last one with you, to get me to go back to Earth and find that monster. I have refused them so often and so firmly that they are convinced I'm afraid to tackle the Knipe. They are convinced that I know I'll fail, and yet they keep after me. If that isn't running around in circles, it'll do until a better example comes along." "They're out of their minds," Benheim said flatly. "Of course, no man in his right mind would try to face down that thing. It would be as silly as trying to outrun a bullet, or do arithmetic faster than a computer. That's common sense. That's showing a healthy respect for the Knipe, not fear. At least, not fear in the way that those men are afraid." Suddenly the detective knew why the industrialist had come. He knew that Moisha Benheim wanted to reassure Stanley Martin, to tell him that he was doing the sensible thing in turning down so dangerous an assignment. He could almost have predicted word for word what Benheim was going to say next. "Nguma may be here at any minute," said the industrialist. "He told me that he was going to come as soon as the trial was over. What are you going to tell him this time? I know it's none of my business, but I'm asking just the same." "I'm going to tell him no," the detective said. "I will not return to Earth for any reason whatever." "Good," said Benheim. "Good. That's the smart thing to do. And don't let him buffalo you. We know you out here in the Belt, Martin. I've been out here for 30 years, and I know what kind of guts it takes to do the things you've done. Those men don't understand space. Nobody understands space until he's lived in it and worked in it, and had cold death only a fraction of an inch away from his skin for hours and days at a time. No matter what those Earthies say, we know you've got more guts than anybody else in the Belt, to say nothing of those stay-at-homes on Earth." "Thank you, I appreciate that," the detective said. But they were only words. He knew that Benheim meant exactly what he said, or thought he meant it, but he also knew that Benheim and others would always wonder why he had turned the job down. God, he thought, I wish I knew. The thought was only momentary. Then, as it had done so many times before, his mind veered away from the dangerous subject. Moisha Benheim stood up. "Well, that's all I had to say, Mr. Martin. I just wanted to warn you that that man might be coming around and to tell you how I felt. Remember what I said about jumping through a hoop. Any time you need me, for anything at all, you just say so. Understand?" "I understand," the detective said, forcing a smile. He rose and shook the industrialist's outstretched hand. "And thanks again," he added. After Benheim had gone, the detective sat thinking, toying with a pencil on his desk. Moishe Benheim, like so many others in the Belt, had come out with nothing but his brain and his 2 hands and the equipment necessary to keep him alive. In 30 years, he had parlayed that into one of the biggest fortunes in the solar system. It was men like that whose respect he valued, and, on the surface, he apparently had that respect. But refusing the Knipe job would dull the bright sheen of that respect, and he knew it. Benheim had talked about how foolish it would be to try to beat the Knipe in a face-to-face encounter, but he hadn't meant it. He knew perfectly well that all Stanley Martin would be expected to do would be to find out where the Knipe's hideout was. Once that had been accomplished, men and machines, most especially machines, could wipe the monster from the face of the earth. One well-placed bomb would do it, if the authorities only knew where to place that bomb. If only. Again his mind veered away, refusing to consider the Knipe too carefully or too closely. The intercom on his desk hummed, and he pressed the switch. "Yes, Helen?" "That Mr. Ngumu was here while Mr. Benheim was with you, Mr. Martin. I followed your instructions and told him that you would not see him." "Fine. Thanks, Helen." "Also, there's a radiogram for you from Earth." "If it's from one of Nguma's colleagues," the detective said, "I don't want to see it. File it in the cylindrical file, under W." "I don't think it is," the secretary said doubtfully. "I can't make any sense out of it. I'd better bring it in." "Okay, and then put that call through to Pelham. I want to get going on that Morton spaceship wrecking. I'm getting itchy for action." She brought in the radiogram and put it on his desk before calling Pelham. She had already read it, of course. It was her job to read such things. The detective picked up the sheet of paper and read it. "The operation is about to begin. I need the other half of my forceps. Come home and join the big parade. Mannheim." It took a second for the words to really impress themselves on his mind. He read them over again. And then the veil began to drop from the closed-off part of his mind. Memories began to swarm back into his mind, memories that had been walled off and kept away from his conscious mind by the hypnotic suggestion implanted so long ago. Oddly, it did not surprise or shock him. He was an expert at hypnosis, especially self-hypnosis. He recognized the message for exactly what it was, a series of code phrases designed to break the blockage that had been placed in his mind. His only reaction was to laugh aloud. "By God," he said, "it worked! It actually worked! Nearly 6 years and I never suspected once." The phone hummed. He switched it on. "Mr. Pelham is on the phone, Mr. Martin," Helen said. He watched as the florid, smiling face of Pelham, his superior, appeared on the screen. "What can I do for you, Martin?" he asked. "I have a favor to ask, Mr. Pelham." "Anything within reason," Pelham said. "After this Benheim affair, you're in good standing around here," he chuckled. "I want a leave of absence," the detective said. Pelham looked a little surprised. "Well, I guess you deserve it. You need a rest, I imagine." "No," the detective said. "No, it isn't that. I'm going after bigger game is all." "What's that?" "I'm going to Earth to find the Knipe." End of chapter 18.